All right, next up, we've got our basic logical functions. And these are your if, and, or types of statements. And we're going to be looking at 5 different functions here. Now, starting with if, the if statement checks if a given condition or logical test is met and returns one value if that condition is true, and another value if the condition is false. So the syntax looks like this. There are 3 arguments starting with the logical test. This is any Boolean test, meaning that it results in a true or a false. So it could be text-based, like country equals USA. It could be numerical, like weekday equals 1, or retail price is greater than 10, right? Something like that. All of those are valid logical tests because they all evaluate to either true or false. Now from there, the second argument of the if statement basically says, if that logical test is true, what value would you like to return? And then the optional third argument allows you to customize the result of that logical test if false. So otherwise, those rows would just show up as blanks. Next up, we've got IFERROR. And this one evaluates a value or an expression and returns a value that you specify if the expression returns an error. So otherwise, go ahead and evaluate the expression just like you normally would. So it's a little bit wordy and it sounds more confusing than it really is. Basically, all you're doing here is you're saying, hey, if you get an error when you return the value or the expression, instead of displaying an error, I want you to display some sort of custom value instead. One thing to keep in mind here is that when an expression returns an error, sometimes those can be very helpful and tell you something important about the error or provide some other troubleshooting information. So use IFERROR cautiously, but it can be a great tool. Up next, we've got switch, and this function may be new to you, but it's used to evaluate an expression against a list of values and return one of the possible results. So saying that a bit differently, switch is commonly used to replace multiple nested if statements. So the syntax for switch starts off with an expression to evaluate and then contains value and result pairs. Right, so we see here we've got expression, value 1, result 1. You could have then value 2, result 2, value 3, result 3, and so on and so forth. So it's okay if this isn't totally clear at the moment. We're going to be working through a whole demo just on the switch function in a little bit. Next, we've got and this kind of speaks for itself because it checks whether 2 arguments are both true and then returns true if that's the case. Otherwise, it returns false. So the syntax looks like this. You just plug in 2 arguments, 2 logical statements. Or is very similar, except instead of checking whether both arguments are true, it checks whether one of the 2 arguments is true. So same syntax here, we're just using or instead of and. So an important note about these two, if you use and or the or functions, you're limited to 2 logical statements. If you want to compare more than 2 statements or conditions, you'll have to use either the double ampersand in place of and or the double pipe in place of or. My tip for you is that using these symbols, the double ampersand and the double pipe, not only gives you more flexibility to work with more than 2 logical statements, but it's also a bit more readable when used in the middle of a function. So let's go ahead, we'll pop into our AdventureWorks file and we'll check these out. All right, so once you've got your file open, we're going to head over to the data view. And for this demo, we're going to use the customer lookup table. So one of the things I like to do is just kind of collapse these to make sure everything kind of stays neat and organized. So we're going to jump into the customer lookup table. And what we're going to calculate is a parent column. And the parent column is going to be a logical or a conditional statement that is based off of the total children field. And basically what it's going to say is that, does this specific customer have children? In other words, is the value in the total children column greater than 0? If it is, then we're going to call that person a parent. Otherwise, not. So this is a really straightforward and easy way to practice that if statement, creating a new calculated column. So we're going to come up here and we're going to create new column. And here we're going to call this column parent. And we're going to start off with our if statement. We've got 3 different parameters. First is our logical test. And again, what we want to say is if our customer lookup table total children is greater than 0, right? That is our logical test. We basically want to say, hey, does this customer have children, right? So if it's greater than 0, I'm going to comma over to my result if true. That's going to equal yes. Add another comma. And again, the third parameter here is optional, but the result if false, we're going to put as no, right? So this is our valid logical test, right? If a customer has more than 0 children, then they are a parent. Otherwise, no. So we'll lock this in here. And there we go. We've got some no responses up top here, and we can see that we have 0 in our total children column. If we scroll down, we have 5 children, 4 children, 1 child, right? We've got yeses for all of these, right? So again, this logical statement seems to be working. So I think we're all good here. One thing to keep in mind, because we've created a calculated column here for parent, the value, right? This no value, if you scroll down, the yes values, all of these values for every row within this column are created based on row context, right? And this is a great example of row context at work. So in order to determine this value of yes, Power BI uses row context by going over to the same row for total children and saying, hey, is it greater than 0, right? If it is, return yes. Otherwise, no. So again, this is just great stuff to really kind of think about and keep in mind as you're learning DAX and really starting to apply these concepts of row and filter context. With that, that's going to wrap up your simple if statement and introduction to logical functions. We're going to use some of the other logical functions that we talked about and operators during some of the other demos in this section, so you'll have plenty of time to practice with them. But up next, let's dig into switch.